The Hall of Bloodlines had not seen silence like this in 3 centuries. Cordelia Vane stood at the far end of the marble corridor, separated from the other daughters by the width of a small eternity. She was not meant to be here. She knew that. Every girl in the hall knew that, from the way Aldara Crestholm turned her silver-ringed fingers away, to the way Mira Ashfall's eyes slid past Cordelia like water over glass, finding nothing worth holding. The hall belonged to the noble families, to the bloodlines recognized by the Covenant of Dusk. Cordelia's family was neither noble nor recognized. Her father had petitioned on a technicality buried in old parchment, that any maiden of Edenvale province may be presented at the choosing if she bears a living mark of the old blood, and the clerk, bored and inattentive, had allowed it. So Cordelia stood there in a dress that had been her mother's, altered twice and still slightly too short, while the daughters of great houses arranged themselves in the candlelight, like they had rehearsed this moment since birth, which, she supposed, they had. The choosing happened once every 50 years. The vampire king had not taken a consort in 400. Cordelia had never truly believed she would be chosen. She had come because her father asked, because refusing him meant watching his hope collapse in on itself like old stone, and because some quiet, reckless part of her wanted to see, just once, what it looked like inside the Hall of Bloodlines, with its ceiling painted in midnight blue and its candles that never burned low. The doors at the far end opened without sound. He entered alone. Cordelia had heard stories about King Valerian Morvain. Every person in Edenvale had. Ancient. Cold as chapel marble, a ruler who had outlasted 17 human monarchies and never once been documented smiling. The stories made him sound like architecture, present, immovable, something you built your life around without ever looking at directly. The reality was quieter than she expected. He was tall, dressed in charcoal and deep burgundy, with none of the theatrical excess she had imagined. No crown, no retinue. He walked as though the room rearranged itself to accommodate him rather than the other way around, which, she slowly understood, it did. The candle flames bent toward him as he passed. The air thickened. His face was the face of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. He began his review at the far end of the line, where the daughters of the highest houses stood. Cordelia watched him pass from girl to girl. He was not unkind, he was precise. A brief pause. A glance. An assessment that held no cruelty and no particular warmth. Several girls flushed when his eyes rested on them. Aldara Crestholm lifted her chin. He moved past Aldara without stopping. Cordelia felt the collective confusion ripple through the room. Aldara was the eldest daughter of the Crestholm seat, the obvious choice, the expected one. The murmurs were almost inaudible, but the hall was very quiet and Cordelia heard them. He kept walking, past Mira Ashfall, past the Duvain twins with their matching amber eyes, past the girl from the western coast whose name Cordelia had never learned. He slowed when he reached the gap in the line, the gap where no one stood, because no one had wanted to stand near the girl who didn't belong. And then he crossed the gap. He stopped before Cordelia. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than before. This one had teeth. She didn't look away, because looking away seemed worse than whatever looking at him might cost her. Up close, his eyes were the color of old silver, the kind that had been handled so many times it had lost its shine but none of its value. They moved across her face with methodical care, the way a reader moves across a page in a language they haven't encountered in centuries but still recognize. He said nothing for a long moment, then, "Your name." His voice was low and even. It didn't rise at the end the way a question should. It was simply an expectation. "Cordelia Vane," she said. Her own voice was steadier than she deserved credit for. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite recognition, but the echo of it. The way a sound carries through stone. "Vane," he repeated. "My lord." She didn't know what else to add. He studied her for another moment. Then he turned to the Chancellor, who stood white-faced at the edge of the hall. "I have made my selection," Valerian Morvain said. The words fell into the room like stones into deep water. The Chancellor looked at Cordelia. He looked back at the king. He opened his mouth once, closed it, and then said very carefully, My lord, the Vane family holds no seat in the covenant. The girl is, she is my selection. The king's voice did not change in volume or tone. It simply became final. Record it. He turned back to the line of assembled daughters. Or rather, he turned away from them entirely because they were no longer relevant. Aldara Crestholm's fan snapped shut. The sound of it was very loud. Cordelia stood in her mother's altered dress in the Hall of Bloodlines and felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes press against her skin like something physical. She felt the hatred in them, not passionate hatred, not the kind born of injury, but the cold, particular hatred of people who have been passed over by something they considered their birthright. She did not feel triumphant. She felt with great precision that her life had just changed into something she did not yet have words for. King Valerian Mervane had already begun walking toward the doors. He did not look back at her. But as he passed the last candelabra, the flames bent in her direction. She was the only one who noticed. 3 days passed before anyone spoke to Cordelia in the East Wing. She had been given chambers that were large enough to feel like a rebuke. All that space, all those draped windows looking out over the Morvain grounds, all that silence. A maid came at dawn and again at dusk, exchanged her washing water, left food on a tray, and departed without meeting her eyes. Whether this was protocol or contempt, Cordelia couldn't determine. She learned the castle by walking it. The Morvain seat was built into the shoulder of a chalk cliff, 3 centuries old in the newest sections and considerably older. Where the stone darkened and the ceilings lowered, Cordelia moved through it slowly, touching nothing, noting everything. The portraits along the eastern gallery tracked backward through time until the faces became unfamiliar entirely, different bone structures, different fashions, but the same silver-gray eyes repeating like a signature across the generations. She found no portrait of the king himself. On the 3rd evening, she found the library. It occupied 2 full floors of the castle's northern tower, and it smelled of cold paper and very old wood. She stood in the entrance for a moment, adjusting to the scale of it, and then she began to read the spines. The collection was organized in a system she didn't immediately understand, not alphabetical, not chronological, but some other principle she couldn't yet see. She was standing on a stepladder, examining a section of texts on provincial bloodlines, when she heard a sound below her. Not footsteps, just a presence. The same thickening of air she had felt in the hall. She looked down. Valerian Morvain stood at the base of the ladder. He was looking at the shelf behind her rather than at her, which struck her as either courtesy or indifference, and she had not yet learned enough about him to know which. That section, he said, is organized by province of origin. Edenvale is on the lower tier. She descended the ladder carefully. I wasn't looking for my family's record. What were you looking for? She considered lying, then decided against it. I was looking for the principle of the system. I couldn't make sense of the order. For a moment, something almost imperceptible moved across his face. It wasn't a smile. It was the shadow of what a smile might have been 400 years ago before whatever had happened to make him stop. Most people give up within the first shelf, he said. Most people probably have somewhere else to be. He looked at her then directly, the way he had in the hall. It had the same quality to it, that sense of being read. You are not afraid of this library, he said. I am not afraid of books. Most of what this library contains is not pleasant. I assumed as much, Cordelia said. That doesn't make it less worth understanding. He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved to one of the reading tables and set down the volume he'd been carrying. She hadn't noticed it until now, a small, dark-covered book with no title on the spine. The system, he said, without preamble, is organized by the nature of the bond between bloodlines and the covenant. Primary bonds on the upper tiers, subordinate lines below, lines that have been sealed, erased, or suppressed are shelved on the lowest level, behind the north wall. She absorbed this. Where is the vein line shelved? He didn't answer immediately. North wall, he said at last. The word suppressed sat between them. She wanted to ask. She kept it inside because she was not bold enough, or perhaps wise enough, to pull at that thread before she understood what was attached to it. You may use the library, he said. There are no restrictions on your access within the castle. You will not be confined. Thank you. He picked up his book. She expected him to leave. He sat down instead at the far end of the reading table and opened the volume. She stood for a moment unsure. Then she climbed the ladder again, found the Edenvale section on the lower tier, and pulled out a slim folio that looked like it predated everything around it. She brought it to the table, not the far end, but not his end either, and opened it. They read in silence for an hour. It was the most comfortable Cordelia had felt since arriving. She didn't examine why. She noted it the way she noted everything carefully, without rushing to conclusions. When she finally looked up, he was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. It was not the assessing look from the hall, and not the distant precision with which he seemed to move through most of the world. It was, she thought, something closer to trouble, as though she had done something unexpected simply by sitting still. She looked back down at her folio. On the third page, she found the first mention of her great-grandmother's name, in ink that had faded to the color of old rust. Beside it, in a different hand, older, more deliberate, were 4 words she didn't recognize as any language she knew. She turned the folio to study the words in the candlelight. She did not notice then the way Valerian Morvain's hand stilled against his book. She did not notice the way his gaze dropped to those 4 words and stayed there. She would, later, piece together what those words meant. The vein blood wakes him. The court of Morvain was not what Cordelia expected, because she had expected there to be one. There were attendants, a dozen perhaps, all of them old in the particular way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with duration. She encountered them in corridors, in the kitchens, around the formal dining table where she ate her meals alone for the first 2 weeks. They were polite in the way Marble was polite, smooth, cool, neither welcoming nor hostile. The other presence in the castle was Lord Cassin, the king's second, a lean, sharp-faced vampire of some 300 years who had made his opinion of the choosing clear through the elaborate performance of never quite acknowledging that Cordelia was in any room he also occupied. She didn't take it personally. She suspected he performed the service for everyone. What she had not expected was the silence of the king. After the library, he had not spoken to her for 4 days. She saw him, briefly, at a distance, crossing the western courtyard at dusk or moving through the corridor outside the gallery. He was always purposeful, always alone, always carrying the sense of someone who had long since decided that the world had said everything it had to say to him. On the 5th day, she was sitting in the gallery when he stopped in the corridor. He didn't come in. He stood in the doorway. That was all. Looking at the portrait she was looking at, it was a woman in a gown of dark blue, painted perhaps 2 centuries ago by the quality of the brushwork. Her expression was difficult to read. Not sad exactly. Not resigned. Something more complex and less nameable. "Who is she?" Cordelia asked. "Lady Maren Ashcroft," the king said, "the previous consort." Cordelia studied the portrait again. What happened to her? She died. The word landed flat. Not cruel, simply accurate, in the way he seemed to find accuracy sufficient. "I'm sorry," Cordelia said, because she was. He didn't respond. She hadn't expected him to. After a moment he said, "She found the gallery difficult." "The portraits? The silence?" Cordelia looked at him then. He was still watching the portrait, his hands clasped loosely behind him, his face arranged in its habitual composure. But there was something in the set of his jaw, not grief exactly, not any more, something that had lived past grief and arrived at something quieter and harder. "I don't find it difficult," she said. "I know." A pause. "That is what I came to." He stopped. Whatever he had been going to say, he reconsidered. "That is why I noted it." He left without further word. Cordelia sat with the strange weight of it. The sense that he had been about to say something else entirely and had caught himself and pulled back. She was beginning to understand that he operated in constant restraint, not coldness exactly, restraint, as though everything he might say or do was measured against some internal standard she couldn't see. She found herself, quietly, curious about what lay on the other side of it. 3 days later, she discovered the East Garden, overgrown, half-wild, threaded with climbing roses gone woody and strange. She was pulling a bramble away from the path when she cut her palm on a thorn she hadn't seen. It was a shallow cut. She pressed her hand against her skirt and kept walking. She didn't hear him arrive. She never did. "You are bleeding," Valerian said, from directly behind her. She turned. He was closer than she'd realized, 3 feet, perhaps less. His eyes had shifted, the silver had deepened, darkened at the edges. She understood, in a purely intellectual way, what that meant, and her heart rate did something she preferred not to examine. "Thorns," she said. "I wasn't paying attention. Let me see." It was not a request precisely, not a command either. It was simply what was going to happen next. She held out her hand. He looked at the cut without touching her. His jaw was tight. She could see him managing something, consciously, carefully, the way a person manages a heavy thing they've been carrying for a very long time. "Go inside," he said. "Have it cleaned. It's barely Cordelia." His voice was still even, but her name in it had a quality she hadn't heard before, something between warning and something else she had no word for yet. She went inside. She cleaned the cut herself, in her chamber with water and linen. When she was done, she sat for a moment looking at the thin red line across her palm. She thought about the way the silver had darkened in his eyes. She thought about the 4 words she'd found in the folio, in the old hand she didn't recognize. She thought, "I should be more afraid of this than I am." She was not afraid. That was the honest answer. She was, instead, deeply and inconveniently interested. She found the sealed archive behind the north wall of the library on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after arriving. It required moving a shelf of liturgical texts that swung on hidden hinges, a mechanism so old and well-balanced that it moved at a breath. Behind it was a narrow room with no windows and 3 locked cabinets, a reading desk, and a lamp that had gone dark so long ago the wick had fossilized. Cordelia lit a candle from the hall, brought it in, and looked at what was there. One of the cabinets was not fully locked. The mechanism had corroded, just enough. Inside, she found a collection of folios bound in black leather, and a single object wrapped in oilskin, flat, roughly the size of her palm. She unwrapped the oilskin with careful hands. It was a piece of stone, pale and almost translucent, carved on one face with a pattern of interlocking lines. The lines were familiar. She had seen them before, in the altered dress her mother had left her, embroidered along the inner hem, in thread so fine it was almost invisible. She turned the stone over. On the reverse, in the same old hand as the folio inscription, was a phrase she also didn't recognize. She sat down at the reading desk and opened the nearest folio. She spent 2 hours in the archive before Valerian found her. He came through the hidden door silently, as he did everything, and stopped when he saw her sitting at the desk. She looked up. His expression, for the first time since she'd arrived, had broken its composure. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet, controlled alarm of someone who has just seen the thing they have been managing against. "Where did you find this room?" he asked. "The shelf moves," she said. "The hinge isn't concealed when you know where to look." He looked at the stone in her hands, then at the folio open before her. "You shouldn't be in here. You didn't tell me it was restricted. There are no restrictions on your access within the castle." He said her own words back to her, and his voice had an edge in it now, not anger, something more like pain. "I failed to anticipate this particular eventuality." "The vein bloodline," Cordelia said carefully. "It's in here, all of it, not just the provincial record, the full account." He said nothing. "There was a prophecy," she continued, "bound to the vein line 400 years ago, suppressed by the covenant because—" She stopped, looked at the folio again. "Because it named the king. Cordelia. It says the vein blood wakes him." She looked up at him. "What does that mean? What were you before? What did the covenant suppress?" The silence stretched out long enough to have its own weight. "Put down the stone," he said. She hadn't realized her grip had tightened. She set it on the desk. He crossed the room in 3 steps. Not quickly, because he never moved quickly, but she had the impression of contained speed, of motion that chose to be slow. He stood at the edge of the desk and looked down at the stone, and something in his face shifted the way a landscape shifts at the end of a very long winter. "When I was young," he said, "and young is a word that means something different when applied to me. There was a binding placed on my nature, by my own hand, before the covenant existed to sanction it. I was—" He paused. "Different. The hunger was different. The attachment was different. I bound those parts of myself and allowed the covenant to seal the record because it was safer for everyone, including myself. The prophecy says the vein blood undoes the binding. The prophecy says a great many things. Does it? Hugh looked at her. It says that the last Bane daughter will carry the key to the binding in her blood, that when the king recognizes her, the suppression will begin to dissolve. A pause. It says the dissolution will be gradual. Cordelia absorbed this. That is why you chose me, she said slowly. In the hall, you recognized something. I recognized the lineage. Not my face, my blood. His jaw tightened. At first, the two words sat between them. She looked down at the cut on her palm. Cleaned now, newly closed. The garden, she said. When I cut my hand, I managed it. You've been managing things since the moment I arrived. Yes, she thought about what it meant to be 400 years old, to have bound away the parts of yourself you didn't trust, and then to have the universe send you a girl in her mother's altered dress who wandered into your sealed archive on a Tuesday and asked you direct questions without flinching. She thought it must be very inconvenient. What happens, she said carefully, when the suppression fully dissolves? He picked up the stone from the desk, turned it over in his hands. His touch on it was practiced. He had held this before many times. That, he said, is what I have spent 4 centuries trying to prevent. He left the archive with the stone. He did not, Cordelia noted, take the folio. She read every document in the archive over the following 5 days. She did this methodically, beginning with the oldest materials and working forward. Because she had always believed in reading things in order, the picture that assembled itself was neither simple nor comfortable. 430 years ago, Valerian Morvain had been a different kind of king. The folios didn't use words like savage or monstrous. They were administrative records, not moral judgments. But between the lines of careful covenant language, she could see the shape of something immense. A vampire lord whose hunger had not been the quiet, controlled thing she knew in the castle. Something older, something that operated on bonds, deep, consuming attachments that he had apparently formed without sanction or limit. The covenant had come to him, not as a governing body, but as a delegation with a proposition. Bind the old nature, accept the modern rule, or war. He had chosen the binding. The folios were careful not to record why. Cordelia sat with the gap where that answer should have been, and thought about a man, an entity, old enough to remember when her bloodline was still a living line with power in it, choosing to suppress his own nature. Rather than wage a war he could probably have won. She thought about what kind of person chose that. On the 5th day, Lord Casson found her in the archive. He stopped at the threshold and looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he actually seemed to see her. The king permitted this, he said. It was not a question. He didn't forbid it. Casson's expression shifted through several things quickly before settling on something careful. You should understand, he said, that Lord Valerian has not voluntarily discussed the binding with anyone in 3 centuries. If he has begun, he told me what it is, Cordelia said. He didn't tell me everything. No. Casson moved into the room slowly and looked at the folios spread across the desk. He wouldn't. He doesn't know everything himself. The suppression glamour works on memory as well as nature. There are things about his old self that are blurred, unclear even to him. Cordelia looked up at him. What were you before the covenant? Casson blinked. It was the first genuinely startled expression she had seen on any face in this castle. I was his second then, as I am now, he said. But we were not. He paused. We were not what we are now. The court was different. The nature of the court was different. And Lady Marin Ashcroft? Cordelia said. Another long pause. She came after the binding, Casson said, when he was already sealed, already what he is now. She was a proper choice from a proper bloodline, and the covenant approved her, and she was kind, and he was kind to her, and none of it. He stopped. None of it was ever quite real, for either of them. She knew. That was why she found the gallery difficult. She could see the portraits of what came before, and she understood that she was a reasonable substitute for something the binding had put out of reach. Cordelia thought about the woman in the dark blue gown, the expression that was not quite sad and not quite resigned. And the vein line, Cordelia said. The prophecy says my blood undoes the binding. Was that always the design? Did someone build this in? Casson looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. We believe it was Lady Erin Vane, your great-grandmother. She was a scholar of the old magic, one of the last. When the Covenant came with their proposition, she did not approve. She believed the binding was a violence done to something that should not have been caged. A pause. She wove the undoing into her own bloodline, as insurance, as hope, I suppose. Cordelia sat very still. She built the key into her children, she said, and waited for the day the right daughter would find her way into this room. She could not have known it would take 4 generations, Casson said, or that the Covenant would manage to suppress even the record of the Vane line. The fact that you are here at all is... He didn't finish the sentence. It's what? Cordelia said. It is either a miracle or a catastrophe, Casson said, depending on what he does with the dissolution once it is complete. He left the archive. Cordelia sat for a long time in the candlelight. She thought about a woman she had never met who had loved something so much she had hidden the cure for its imprisonment inside her own blood, folded into the lineage, like a letter sealed inside a wall, waiting for someone to break through. She thought about her great-grandmother's handwriting in the folio, deliberate, precise, angry. She thought about Valerian Morvain choosing the binding. She thought, he chose it. Whatever it cost him, he chose it, and that she decided was important. He came to the library on the 6th night after the archive, and this time he sat down at her end of the table. She was reading a Covenant jurisdictional text, dry, dense, exhausting, but she was building toward something, and she needed the legal architecture before she could approach the next folio. She was dimly aware of him settling into the chair 3 feet away, of the way the candles responded to his presence. He said, "You have read the full account." It wasn't accusatory. "Yes," she said. "Then you know what you are to the binding." She set down the text. "I know what my blood is to the binding. I'm not certain that's the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "You make distinctions." "I try to." He folded his hands on the table. She had noticed his hands before, the way they were always still, as though he had trained himself to move only with intention. "The dissolution began the night I chose you," he said. "It has been continuing since. Slowly, the glamour resists." He paused. "I can feel it when I am near you, the resistance and the dissolution simultaneously. Does it hurt?" He appeared to consider whether to answer. "Not precisely," he said at last. "It is more like remembering something you did not know you had forgotten." Cordelia thought about that. The binding suppresses memory as well. "Yes. What are you remembering?" He looked at her for a long moment. In the candlelight, the silver of his eyes had that deeper quality. Not quite the darkness that came with hunger, but something more complex. She had begun to catalogue his expressions, the fine gradations of them, because there were no broad ones. "I am remembering," he said carefully, "what it felt like to want things. Not to hunger. The hunger is still present. It is always present, but it is not the same as wanting. Wanting has an object. It is." He stopped. "It has been a long time. What did you want?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, not pressing. She had learned that pressing him produced silence. Gentleness produced more. "Constancy," he said, after a pause. "In the old accounts, it would have been called a bond. One attachment, singular and complete, that did not diminish with time. The Covenant found it excessive, dangerous." He looked at the table. "Inconvenient, I believe, was also used. An attachment like that to whom?" "No one." He looked up. "That was always the problem. I bound the capacity before it fixed itself anywhere. There was no one specific, only the capacity itself and the Covenant's fear of what I might become if it attached." Cordelia absorbed this. A man who had locked away the ability to love, specifically, before he could love anyone in particular, as a precaution, as a sacrifice. She thought it was the saddest thing she had heard in her life, and she had heard several sad things. "Lord Casson said it was a violence," she said. "Lord Casson has always been free with his opinions on the subject. He's not wrong." "No," Valerian said. "He is not. She looked at him across the 3 feet of table. He was looking at his hands again. Something in the set of his shoulders. Not slumped, he didn't slump, he was constitutionally incapable of it, but something in the line of them that she hadn't seen before. A weight that had been there so long it had become structural and was now, perhaps, becoming visible. "What happens," she asked, "when it finishes dissolving?" "I don't know," he said. "The folios don't record what happens after." Lady Erin Vane built the undoing. She didn't describe the outcome. Because she didn't know it herself? Because she trusted the nature of the thing? He paused. She believed that what had been suppressed was not dangerous, only inconvenient. And the Covenant? The Covenant will not agree. His voice was very flat. They will perceive it as a violation of the terms of the binding. They will send someone. When? Soon, he said. There is a Covenant observer stationed in the village. He has been reporting the changes he has observed in my demeanor. I expect a delegation within the fortnight. Cordelia looked at him steadily. And the girl whose blood is undoing you, she said. What happens to her? The silence this time was of a different kind, not his usual measured quiet. Something more raw. Nothing will happen to you, he said. I will not permit it. It was the most direct thing he had said to her since the Hall of Bloodlines. It was also, she realized, the first time he had said something that was not a fact or an observation or a precision. The first thing he had said that was simply, plainly, a promise. She didn't examine what that meant then. She picked up the jurisdictional text and returned to her reading. But she felt his eyes on the side of her face for a long time after. He was 40 miles from the castle when the dissolution moved past the point of resistance. It happened between one moment and the next, the way certain irrevocable things do, not with drama, but with the quiet irreversibility of a lock turning over. He felt it in his chest, which had not been a useful location for feeling things in 4 centuries, a kind of opening. He thought of winter water, thawed. He turned his horse around. He had ridden out to meet the Covenant delegation before they reached the castle, to intercept them on neutral ground where the conversation would be procedural and contained, and Cordelia would not be present to be looked at. He had intended to manage this the way he managed everything, from a position of control, with advanced preparation, with the dissolution still inside the boundary of the binding's last resistance. The dissolution had not consulted his timing. He rode hard. He arrived to find the delegation already within the castle grounds. There were 4 of them. Chancellor Drave at the head, who had served the Covenant for 200 years and believed in its rules with the particular devotion of someone who had never questioned whether the rules were correct. 2 senior arbiters, and 1 woman Valerian recognized with a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with nature, High Arbiter Selene, who had been present at the original binding and had voted for it with both hands. They were in the East Hall when he entered. Cordelia was there. He had not thought she would be there, but of course she was. She had been systematically examining every room in the castle for weeks, and the East Hall contained a set of pre-Covenant maps she had mentioned wanting to study. She stood at the far side of the room, with her arms loosely at her sides, watching the delegation with the expression he had come to know, composed, observant, giving nothing unnecessary. Selene was looking at her with the expression of someone making a calculation. Lord Mervane. Chancellor Drave turned. We have come under the provisions of Article 14, which governs violations of sanctioned bindings. Reports indicate, I am aware of what the reports indicate, Valerian said. The dissolution is confirmed? He looked at Cordelia. She looked back at him. It is confirmed, he said. Selene stepped forward. Then the Vane girl must be removed from the estate and placed under Covenant custody, pending review of no. The word was quiet. It was not negotiable. Selene's eyes narrowed. The binding's provisions are clear. If the Vane bloodline has been deliberately positioned to undermine the terms of the binding was a voluntary act, Valerian said, entered without coercion and without Covenant requirement. I bound myself. The Covenant sanctioned it. They did not mandate it. The dissolution of a voluntary act is not a violation of treaty. The dissolution was engineered by the Vane line. By a woman 400 years ago who believed something unjust had been done and chose to try to correct it. He moved further into the room. The delegation adjusted its position, very slightly, in ways that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't been reading bodies for centuries. Fear, not of him, They had never precisely feared him of what he might become. You may argue the legality of Lady Erin Vane's methodology at length. I will participate in that discussion willingly. What I will not participate in is any action taken against her descendant. You have no standing to. I am the king, Valerian said, very quietly, of the Morvan seat and its territories. You are guest here under the custom of covenant consultation, which extends to discussion and debate, not enforcement. If you attempt enforcement within my territories, the Treaty of 1712 applies, and I think you will find the language rather more favorable to the estate's sovereign rights than you currently remember. The room was very still. Selene looked at Cordelia. There was calculation in it and something else, the beginning of a new assessment. The dissolution will complete, Selene said. When it does, Valerian said, we will discuss its implications. As civilized parties. He moved to stand between the delegation and the far side of the room where Cordelia stood. It was not a dramatic gesture, he simply went there, because it was where he needed to be. I will invite the delegation to dinner where we will speak of Article 14 and the provisions of voluntary binding in some detail, after which you are welcome to remain as guests or to depart. I believe the inn in the village has acceptable accommodations. The delegation exchanged glances. Very well, Chancellor Drave said after a pause. They filed out. Selene was last. She looked at Cordelia one more time before she left, and Cordelia held her gaze without difficulty. When the door closed, Valerian turned. Cordelia said, You memorized the Treaty of 1712. I attended the negotiation, he said. I wrote 2 of the articles. A pause. The one about sovereign enforcement rights, she said. That one, he confirmed, was written specifically for circumstances of this nature. He watched something move through her face. Not surprise, he had begun to learn she was rarely surprised. Something more like the careful, private satisfaction of understanding how something had been built. Thank you, she said. He said nothing, but he remained in the room for another hour, and this time he stood much closer to her end of the window. The dinner with the Covenant delegation lasted 4 hours, and resolved very little in legal terms, and everything in practical ones. Valerian spoke for 3 of those hours in the careful, precise language of someone who had been building arguments for centuries. Selene pushed back on every point, and he absorbed each push and redirected it with the patience of someone who had long since stopped being interested in winning and had instead become interested in correctness. By the time the dessert course was cleared, the Covenant's position had not changed officially, but its conviction had visibly eroded. Cordelia sat through all 4 hours. She asked 3 questions, each of which were so precise they created small silences that lasted disproportionately long. Chancellor Drave looked at her differently by the end of the evening than he had at the beginning. The delegation departed the following morning. Selene was the last to go, as she had been the last to leave the East Hall. At the gate, she paused and looked back at the castle with an expression that Cordelia, watching from the window above, could not fully read. Then she got into her coach, and the gates closed. She'll be back, Lord Casson said, appearing at Cordelia's shoulder. I know, Cordelia said. He bought time. Yes. That's what he does when he can't resolve something. He buys time. Casson's voice was not unkind. He's been doing it for 400 years. Cordelia looked at the closed gates. Not with me, she said. He told me the truth about the dissolution from the beginning. He didn't try to manage it away. Casson was quiet for a moment. No, he said, he didn't. He left her at the window. She found Valerian in the east garden that evening, the same garden where the thorns had cut her palm. He was standing at the far end of the path, looking at the chalk cliff in the dying light. She came to stand a few feet away and didn't speak. He said, It's nearly complete. She felt it, she realized, had been feeling it for days without knowing what to call it. A kind of resonance, very quiet, like a note struck on a string too long to vibrate quickly. Something that hummed at the edge of sensation. I know, she said. When it finishes, he said, the capacity will fix itself. It will attach, as it was always designed to do. He was still looking at the cliff. It is not a polite process. It is not measured. What I was before was not restrained in the way I have learned to be restrained. Are you warning me? I am being honest with you. I owe you that. You owe me a great deal more than that, she said, not unkindly. Your entire binding has been quietly undone by my blood. I think I'm owed most of the relevant information. He turned to look at her. The silver of his eyes was fully deep in now, not with hunger, or, not only, with everything the binding had sealed away and the dissolution had been returning. Want, she thought. The direct, uncoded thing he had described in the library, the capacity he said has already begun to fix. She held his gaze. Has it decided where? She asked. Yes. The word was very quiet. She had known, she thought. She had known for a while, in the particular way that you know things you are not yet ready to name. She had been feeling her way toward it in the dark, careful, one hand against the wall, and now she was standing in the room and the light was on. She didn't step back. He moved toward her slowly, the kind of slowness that was a choice, a decision made in real time, giving her every possible moment to decide differently. He stopped when he was close enough that she could feel the cold that he carried, the old, bloodless cold of something that had lived past ordinary temperature. He raised one hand and very carefully, with a precision that cost him something visible, laid his palm against the side of her face. She didn't breathe for a moment. His hand was cold and still, and she could feel beneath the stillness the thing that the stillness was containing. I have been managing, he said quietly, for a very long time. I know, she said. I would like to stop. She reached up and covered his hand with hers. She felt the dissolution complete, then, not dramatically, not with sound or light, but with the absolute silence of a thing finally released. It moved through the space between them like water finding its level, and something in his face, something she had never seen before, became visible. Not the shadow of a smile, the thing itself, brief, restrained, still, but real. Cordelia, he said. Yes, she said, as though to both the things it might mean. The covenant returned, as Cassine had predicted, 6 weeks later. This time there were 7 of them. Selene led the delegation again, and her expression when she arrived at the gates was that of someone who had spent 6 weeks building a legal argument and had arrived to discover that the ground had shifted while she was working. The ground had shifted. The castle itself felt different, not dramatically, because nothing about Valerian Morvain was dramatic, but in the accumulated weight of small things. He met Cordelia in the library without a reason now. He sat at her end of the table. He had, on 3 occasions, gone to find her when she was simply in another room, for no articulated purpose, and stood in the same space as her for a while, and then left. He had, once, told her something he found beautiful about a piece of music she was listening to. He had stopped himself halfway through the description, appeared mildly surprised at himself, and continued. She had not commented on it. She had, internally, held it very carefully. When the delegation filed into the East Hall, the preferred room, apparently, for confrontations, Valerian was already there. So was Cordelia, on purpose this time, and Lord Casson, which she suspected was also on purpose. Selene looked at the assembled arrangement and seemed to make a decision. The dissolution is complete, she said. It was not a question. Yes, Valerian said. The capacity has fixed. A brief pause. Yes. Selene's gaze moved to Cordelia, to the vain girl. To Lady Cordelia, Valerian said, who is the selected consort of the Morvain seat, under the established rights of the choosing, which the covenant sanctioned 8 weeks ago without objection. I will ask you to use her correct title. Selene absorbed this. The bond you have formed is not sanctioned. The bond that has formed, he said, is the natural consequence of the dissolution of a voluntary act, as I argued in detail at our last meeting, which I believe the record reflects. He looked at her steadily. The covenant chose to sanction the binding. The covenant chose to sanction the choosing. You cannot sanction both and then object to the logical outcome of their interaction. The old nature is dangerous. The old nature is mine, he said. The evenness in his voice had an edge in it now, not anger. Something more fundamental. It was my nature before the covenant existed. What I bound voluntarily at cost to myself, because I believed it was the right thing to do at the time. I did not surrender ownership of it. I held it in abeyance. He paused. The circumstances that made the binding advisable no longer apply. I am not the entity I was 4 centuries ago. Neither is the covenant. Selene was quiet for a long moment. "There will need to be a review," she said at last. "There will always need to be a review," he said. "I will cooperate with any review conducted within the jurisdictional provisions of the 1712 Treaty." "You keep citing that treaty." "Because I wrote the relevant articles," he said, "specifically so that I would always have recourse to them." Cordelia watched Selene absorb this, watched the High Arbiter look at Valerian. Really look at him, she thought, for perhaps the first time in a long time. Not at what he had been or what the binding had made him, but at what was there now. What was there now was very difficult to dismiss. "The Vane lineage," Selene said slowly. "Lady Erin Vane built the dissolution into her bloodline with deliberate intent. There is a question of whether that constitutes interference with covenant proceedings." "Lady Erin Vane died 180 years ago," Cordelia said. Every head in the room turned to look at her. She had not raised her voice. She had simply spoken, clearly. "You cannot hold her accountable, and you cannot hold me accountable for what my blood is, which I did not choose and did not design. I am the outcome of a decision made before my grandmother's grandmother was born." She looked at Selene steadily. "If you wish to make a legal argument about Lady Erin Vane's methodology, I believe there is a jurisdictional question about whether the Covenant has authority over actions taken before the current treaty framework existed. I have been reading the relevant documents." A silence. "She's been reading the archive," Casson said, to no one in particular, in a tone that was somewhere between admiration and resignation. Selene looked at Cordelia for a long moment, and then, slowly, something in the High Arbiter's posture changed. Not softening precisely, something more like reluctant reassessment. "We will conduct the review," Selene said, "in accordance with the 1712 provisions." "That is all I ask," Valerian said. When the delegation left the hall, Valerian turned to look at Cordelia. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She gathered her notes. She had brought notes, of course she had, and met his eyes, and he looked at her with that thing in his face she had begun to learn, the open, quiet, enormous thing that 4 centuries of binding had kept sealed, and that was now simply present in him like weather. She thought, he looks terrifying and ordinary at once. She thought, I am not afraid. The thing that came in the night was not from the Covenant. He felt it before the wards registered it. The particular vibration of something old, something from before the Covenant, something that had no reason to be this far from the Western Territories unless it had been sent. He was out of his chamber before the second ward pulse, and he knew by the quality of the silence that Cordelia was still asleep, and he intended her to remain so. He did not. She was in the corridor when he reached it, wrapped in a dark robe, her hair loose, her face carrying the expression of someone who had been awakened by something that registered below hearing. "Stay inside," he said. She looked at him. "What is it?" "Something old, not Covenant." He put one hand briefly on her arm. He did that more easily now, touched her without the elaborate management of before, though he was still careful, always careful with her. "Inside, please." She looked at his face. Then she went back to her chamber, and he heard the latch. He went to the east wall. The thing that cleared the wall was approximately the shape of a man, but the resemblance ended there. Pre-Covenant, pre-binding, pre-everything that had organized the night world into its current architecture. Valerian recognized it by its eyes, the particular flat darkness of something that had never been asked to restrain itself. An assassin, then, old enough to remember the pre-binding world, and paid well enough by someone. Not the Covenant, he thought, because the Covenant would not sanction this. Someone who did not want the dissolution to have occurred. The encounter was not brief. It was not, he discovered, particularly difficult either. What the dissolution had returned to him was not simply the capacity to attach. It was, underneath that, the nature that had existed before the attachment had been bound, the full architecture of what he was, the parts that 4 centuries of careful restraint had kept very quiet. He had forgotten, in the long, gradual way of forgetting things that are suppressed rather than lost, what it felt like to be entirely himself. It felt like standing in a room with all the walls removed. He was, as it turned out, considerably more formidable than the Covenant had ever needed to know. When it was done, he stood in the east yard in the pre-dawn silence and thought about Selene, and about the Covenant review, and about whoever had sent something this old to his castle rather than allow the review to proceed through legal channels. He would need to know who. He went back inside. He found Cordelia in the corridor outside her chamber. She had not, he observed, stayed inside. She was standing very still, and she was looking at him, and he realized, with a kind of clarity that the binding had never permitted, that he could see exactly what was on her face: relief, and underneath the relief, a controlled fear that she had been managing since she heard the words. Not fear of him, fear for him. He had not had anyone fear for him in a very long time. He crossed the corridor and stood before her, and without any particular thought beyond the fact that it was correct, he put both hands on her face and looked at her, making sure she was uninjured, making sure she was real. "You didn't stay inside," he said. "I never said I would," she said. "I went back to my room. I didn't say I'd stay there. That is a very precise distinction. I am a very precise person." He looked at her. She looked at him. Her hands came up and wrapped around his wrists, holding them. Not to remove them, just to hold. "It's done," he said. "Who sent it?" "I don't know yet. Someone with access to pre-covenant resources and a vested interest in the dissolution not having occurred. The covenant review begins in 3 days. Yes, he thought, if someone is attempting to circumvent the review by removing me before it concludes, then the review must conclude first, she said. Yes, we have 3 days. We do. She looked at him steadily. In the gray pre-dawn light, with her hair loose and her expression clear and her hands around his wrists, she looked like something his great-grandmother might have painted. The kind of image that meant more than the scene itself. He thought, I chose her because I recognized the blood. He thought, that is not why I would choose her now. Go back inside, he said, properly, both feet the whole night. The night is almost over. What remains of it then? She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she went, and this time he heard the latch and stayed by the door until the first light came. He thought about 3 days, about legal texts and jurisdictional provisions and the 1712 treaty, and about the girl on the other side of the door who had been reading the archive by candlelight since the 3rd week of her arrival. He thought, she is going to argue them into submission herself if I give her the opportunity. He thought, I am going to give her the opportunity. The covenant review lasted 2 days and 4 hours. Selene led it, as Selene led everything. She was thorough, rigorous, and clearly troubled in a way that had nothing to do with the law, and everything to do with something she hadn't decided yet. Valerian answered every question without evasion. Cordelia sat at his right hand and answered the questions directed at her with the same calm precision she brought to everything. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, Cordelia produced Lady Vayne's original folio, not a copy, the original, and placed it before the review panel and directed their attention to a particular passage in the old hand. She then produced 3 subsequent documents from the archive, each predating the current covenant treaty framework, each establishing a principle of blood sovereignty that the covenant had never formally rescinded because no one had had sufficient reason to invoke it before. She had cross-referenced all 3. The silence that followed was long. She's been building this case, Casson said quietly at Valerian's shoulder, since the 1st week. Yes, Valerian said. You knew? I suspected. After the archive, I suspected. He looked at her, at the straight line of her back, the careful steadiness of her hands on the documents, the way she spoke to Selene as an equal without any apparent awareness that this was remarkable. I didn't interfere. Because you wanted to see what she'd do? Because, he said, it was hers to do. The review panel withdrew for 3 hours. When they returned, Selene set her hands on the table and looked at both of them. The blood sovereignty provision is valid, she said. The dissolution of a voluntary binding undertaken by a sovereign entity, where the mechanism of dissolution is embedded in an allied bloodline prior to the treaty framework, falls outside covenant jurisdiction. She paused. The bond is acknowledged. The room was quiet. I would add, Selene said, and her voice had shifted. Not warmly, she was not a warm person, but with the specific quality of someone making an admission they'd been working toward for some time, that Lady Vayne's methodology was not interference. It was foresight. Another pause. The original binding was. She stopped. The original vote was not unanimous. I voted in favor. I have thought about that vote a great deal, over the years. She did not say she had been wrong. But she did not need to. After the delegation left, Cordelia sat at the table in the East Hall with the documents spread before her, and for the first time since Valerian had known her, she looked tired, not defeated. She was constitutionally incapable of that, but the particular tiredness of someone who has held something taut for a very long time and is only now allowing themselves to set it down. He sat beside her. Not at the other end of the table, beside her. She looked at the documents. "We still need to find out who sent the thing in the night," she said. "We do. And Selene will be a useful ally in that, I think." She was already moving toward reassessment before the review. She was. Cordelia was quiet for a moment. "She voted for the binding," she said. "She knows that, yes. And she's been living with it for 400 years. A pause. Almost as long as you've been living with the binding itself." He looked at her. "Are you sympathizing with Selene?" "I am understanding her," Cordelia said. "That's different." She looked at the folio with her great-grandmother's handwriting. Lady Erin Vane understood it too, I think. She wasn't angry at the covenant. She was correcting an error quietly from inside the structure. She was patient. She had to be. She didn't know how long it would take. He thought about that, about a woman building a key into her own blood and trusting the future to use it, about the 4 generations of Vane daughters who had lived ordinary lives without knowing what they carried. He thought about Cordelia in her mother's altered dress in the Hall of Bloodlines, standing in the gap where no one wanted to stand. "You never asked me," he said, "why I chose you." She turned to look at him. "I knew why you chose me. The blood, the lineage." "That is why I identified you," he said. "The blood is why I stopped walking. But I have been at many choosings, and I have identified bloodlines before, and I have always kept walking." She waited. "You were standing in a gap," he said. Every other girl in that hall had been placed by her family, positioned by years of preparation, assured by everyone around her that she was the correct answer. And you were standing in a gap because no one wanted to stand near you and you were still. He paused. "You were simply watching, taking it in, making no bid for anything. I had nothing to bid with. Everyone in that room had nothing but things to bid with," he said. "They were made of their bids. You were made of something else." She looked at him for a long moment. "I thought it was the blood," she said. "It was the blood that made me stop. It was you that made me choose." She was quiet. He watched her process this with a careful, unhurried thoroughness she brought to everything. No performance, no answer before the thinking was done. Then she reached across the table and opened her great-grandmother's folio to the last page, blank, in the original record. But for 4 words in the old hand at the very bottom. "The Vane blood wakes him." She laid her hand flat on the page. "She knew," Cordelia said softly. "She knew what she was building toward." "I believe she did. She built you a way back to yourself." She looked up. "And she built herself into my blood, so I would find this room." "Yes, that is either the greatest act of faith I have ever heard of," Cordelia said, "or the most extraordinary presumption." He considered this. Could it be both? For the first time in his memory, Cordelia Vane laughed, briefly, quietly, the sound of someone who had not been expecting it themselves. It passed quickly, the way all things about her passed quietly, leaving only the remnant of warmth in her expression. He felt the bond then, not as the dissolution had described it, not as a process or a chemistry or a mechanic, but as itself, the simple, enormous, ancient fact of it, one attachment, singular and complete, that would not diminish with time. Exactly as he had been built to feel, exactly as 4 centuries of silence had not erased. He did not say any of this. It was not necessary. She could see it on his face, which had stopped being so carefully closed. She had done that too, not by force, not by pressure, but by the same quality she had shown in the hall, simply being present, being real, making no bid for anything. Outside, the Morvain grounds lay in the long gold of late afternoon. The chalk cliff caught the light. The east garden was probably, he thought, attempting to reclaim the path again. "The thorns will need to be cut back," he said. "The thorns are fine," she said. "They just need someone to pay attention to them." She closed the folio. She stayed at the table. He stayed beside her, and the candles for once burned without bending.